3 years ago, I was contracted by the council to do an exhibition on Charles Howard Bury and the 1921 reconnaissance mission, which forms the basis of this talk. Also, while I'm not a mountaineer, I was in Tibet back in 2007. I didn't take the hard route, I took the train from Beijing to Lhasa, but I have some familiarity with the landscape and the Tibetan plateau and the general area. But to fill in the gaps in my knowledge, we took advantage of the last speaker, Frank Nugent, a world-class mountaineer, and I hope you don't mind me saying, a very nice guy, Frank, who gave us, and you'll see a few clips from Frank in the talk as well, talking about the mountaineering aspects of it, what it's like to work at that altitude, and Howard Bury's significance within the wider context of Everest exploration. So this is the shameless bit of self-promotion. That's on RTÉ at the moment, every Sunday nights at 7:30, if you want to tune in. We're on to episode 3 this Sunday night, which has a strong Westmeath connection, even though it's Athlone, not Mullingar. Right, there's the man we're here to talk about, Charles Howard Bury. I won't go into much detail on his background and his life, because Ruth obviously covered it so well. But we'll just, because the photos are so great, I'll overlap slightly with Ruth's talk. Varies Charleville Castle, for example, where he grew up. But it's in 1900, he's posted to India in the 1900s, and he actually, long before his Everest exhibition, he actually spends some time in Tibet. He secretly entered the country in 1905, just across the border. So it obviously had a long-term fascination for him. He actually got in quite a deal of trouble with the British authorities at that time, was severely reprimanded. But I suppose, given the connections that Ruth outlined, he wasn't a guy that you could punish safely, so he was able to get away with breaking the rules. And that's one of his trips, obviously, a postcard. One of the things we did 3 years ago is there was over 1,000 photographic plates and negatives in Mullingar Library, which we had digitized, and they're now available to researchers and to the public, or to anybody who wants to peruse them. And there's some fascinating material in there. Now, this 1913, I just want to give you a sense of his travels beforehand. Ruth was talking about the Tian Shan Mountains, and just to give a bit of context, this is Kyrgyzstan, and this is China, and Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. So he started off in the Xinjiang area of China, and this is the route he took. There's a couple of routes. Even to this day, people are unsure of his exact route, but we know he took along the top here, going towards the cities of Tashkent and Samarkand, cities that are famous in antiquity, especially Samarkand, because it's of its location on the old Silk Route. There are some of the just general photos he took of transport in the area, the mountains themselves. He was always a good photographer of people's daily lives, and that's women preparing a tent somewhere along his journey, various people he encountered along the way. There's Agu beginning his journey to being on a wall in a Mullingar hotel. Poor guy. So that's him at his cutest, I think. As Ruth said, he got bigger and bigger very quickly, and it just like the reading about the account of him being carried on the train is mental, to be honest. So he eventually ended up coming back, and he used wrestle, as Ruth was saying, or Charles Howard Bury would, I don't know if Agu was too disposed to be wrestling people, but he was forced into it by Charles Howard Bury, but he became too aggressive and ended up in Dublin Zoo. More photos from Tian Shan. And that's not of Charles Howard Bury, but that is one. He was in, as Ruth said, the Great German Offensive of 1918. He was captured. He ended up in 3 different German prisoner of war camps during the Second World War. Karlsruhe, that's one of the camps he was in. He escaped on one occasion and was able to remain free for about a week, because he was partly, I guess, because he was a fluent German speaker. He was a remarkably talented linguist and was able to speak multiple languages. Figures vary, you'd see ludicrous of 30, 40, but he could speak probably 10, 12, or at least if he wasn't fluent, he could converse in a wide degree of languages and languages from different language families as well. So now we start to get into the Mount Everest. I'm going to show a more detailed version of that map soon, because it's a very good map, and we'll see this area here, the Changla, the North Col, becomes central to the story we're trying to tell. I won't be getting into the geology, just partly because I'm not an expert. I just wanted to show this because we're going to be talking about the Tibetan plateau. So you can see Tibet here. It's at an elevation of about 5,000 meters, probably slightly less, and the Himalayan mountains themselves, an area of there was a huge earthquake in 2015 in Nepal, so it's a very geologically active area, which is of course the reason why those mountains exist and are still rising despite erosion. So when we talk about they're going to be walking along this Tibetan plateau heading towards Everest, and we'll explain why in a moment. Just an example from that 2015 earthquake is famous because some of you might remember the footage on Everest of the mountaineers being caught in an avalanche, but it actually killed like 9,000 or 10,000 people across the whole area, especially in Nepal. Now, we get to Mount Everest and the naming of Mount Everest, and we'll talk about why the British were so keen to reach the mountain and be the first to climb it, why they were willing to expend such resources on this project. You know, as we'll get into, Howard Bury's mission wasn't to climb the mountain, it was a reconnaissance mission, and it was the first of many. As you know, it wasn't until decades later that the mountain was actually climbed. Now give me one moment here and I'll catch up with my notes. This chap is called Radhanath Sikdar, and he was a mathematician, technically called the computer for the Indian survey, which began in the early 1800s. The British were attempting to map India to learn more, obviously, and to have a better understanding of the country's resources and its value. And that was a long-term project. You're mapping a whole subcontinent, so it took many decades. But in the 1820s, 1830s, they start to become aware that there's this huge mountain that is maybe taller than any other mountain in the vicinity. And originally, it doesn't become named at first. Initially, it's known as Peak B in the 1830s, and that's when Sikdar computes. Now, he doesn't get the calculations exactly right, but he computes that this is the highest mountain in the world, and it starts to become the focus of more and more British attention. As they learn more about it, around 1852, a guy called Waugh, Andrew Scott Waugh, he's a civil servant, and he decides that they've pretty much established that this mountain now, which they call mountain or Peak 15 at this stage, is the highest mountain in the world. So he decides it'll be a great wheeze, it'll be a great opportunity for his self-advancement to call the mountain after his boss, George Everest. This guy, there's a number of problems with this. The tradition up to this point was to name peaks and mountains, based on local names or appropriations or derivations of local names. So it was quite unusual for a mountain to be named after a British official like this. And there was other complications. Everest is actually pronounced Everest, so the mountain should technically be called Mount Everest. But also, he didn't want the mountain to be called after him. Apparently, it's very hard to say. His name is hard to say in Hindi. And he wanted to stick with the original tradition, but nevertheless he was overruled, and Mount Everest was given that name, and it's the name by which it's most widely known. But as we go through the talk, we'll talk about some of the names that Howard Bury encountered, and some of the names by which it's known previous to that and in the wider vicinity. Now, the British had been the great polar explorers during the 1900s and into the 1800s into the 1900s, but remarkably they'd been beaten to both the North and South Pole. That's Roald Amundsen, got to the South Pole. That's Robert Peary, a poster lauding his achievements in reaching the North Pole, even though researchers now think that he actually didn't reach the pole. He got close, but not exactly. But either way, it was an American triumph, or seen to the world as an American triumph. But that left the British without looking around for opportunities to say, okay, we've lost out on the North and South Pole, where can we look next? So they began to look towards the tallest mountain in the world, which they referred to, or colloquially it was often named as the third pole. This was the great, outstanding achievement for humanity, to try and reach this third pole, the roof of the world. So that's why there was more of this attention focused on Mount Everest. Now, Nepal was closed to foreigners, as we'll see, so they had the trouble that it wasn't easily accessible, and they were going to have to access it. This is part of India here, Sikkim province. They were going to have to come around, but Tibet was also closed to foreigners for much of this period. That's why Howard Bury got in trouble in 1905 for sneaking into the country. So little was known about the mountain and about its geography, about the actuality of being there. And this is a graphic from a newspaper called The Sketch, a pictorial newspaper in England in the early 1900s, or just before actually, sorry, the 1921 exhibition. And it shows how, various attempts to get close to Everest. Major Noel, who we'll talk about again, he probably, that's about 50 miles out. So, nobody had really got closer than 40 miles in, 30, 40 miles to Everest at this stage. So there was very little, there was no mapping, and there was very little known about the topography here, other than that there was this giant peak in the midst of it. So we'll come back to a few of these. One of the great things about the exhibition is not only did they produce a narrative that Ruth mentioned that was published a year later, which gives a very detailed account of the expedition, but they were also sending back telegraphs, or by messenger, they'd eventually become telegraphs, messages back to Europe, back to Britain, and back to the United States, partly because the funders of the exhibition, the Alpine Club and the Royal Geographical Society in the UK, had signed publicity agreements with newspapers and so on to fund the exhibition. Now, we're going to come back to these guys in a minute, and we'll talk about them, and we're going to talk more about that map. But I just want to talk briefly about Tibet, and Tibet in the early 1900s. Now, we all know the situation with Tibet today. It's part of, it's supposedly an autonomous region, but it's a part of China, and it has been for many decades now. But in 1921, Tibet was in the midst of a brief period in which it had freedom. Effectively, it's had its own independence. Throughout the 19th century, you've heard of the Great Game, this kind of constant back and forth and manoeuvring and politicking between the great powers. Now, Tibet's location put it just obviously close to the British Empire, but it also was in touching distance of its obviously borders China, and also Russians. The Russian Empire was seeking influence in the area. So there's this constant manoeuvring between the three sides, to the extent that in the early 1900s, British officials in India, there becomes a kind of a panic. If you think back to the first, or the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where there was weapons of mass destruction apparently in Iraq, and that justified the war. There was a similar situation in India and British India at this time, that the Russians were taking a huge influence in Tibet, and they were going to turn it into a Russian sphere of influence. So there was an invasion, a British invasion of Tibet in 1903 and into 1904, which devastated Tibetan forces. The British reached Lhasa and forced the Tibetans to sign an agreement, effectively giving into all, promising that they'd become a British, not a protectorate as such, but they would align themselves with British interests. And they were also forced to sign an agreement, a war indemnity, giving funds to the British Empire. That was highly controversial at the time, and the British subsequently rode back on it, and they cancelled the indemnity. But there was bad blood at the time between Britain and Tibet. However, the Chinese reasserted their control after the British left, but the age of the Chinese emperors, or the non-communist Chinese emperors ended in 1912, 1913, and Tibetans took advantage. There was the beginning of a Chinese republic, and because of the chaos in China, Tibet took advantage to form its own state. So the 13th Dalai Lama, who had fled the country when previously, the predecessor of the modern Dalai Lama, who's the 14th, he returned to the country, and there was a Tibetan government in place from 1913 onwards. And they started putting out feelers to the British, for example, saying, look, you know, let's put aside our torturous history, but maybe we can work together. We want to remain an independent country, but we don't want to become a province of China or the Russians or the British Empire, but we could, you know, there can be mutual self-interest. So you start to have these negotiations between the British and the Chinese. And Howard Bury, after the First World War, travels to Tibet in 1920, briefly enters the country and meets with a guy called Bell, who's a British official in China. And the Bell goes to the Dalai Lama, and they're able to work out an agreement whereby a British expedition can enter Tibet for the first time. And the Tibetans get out of that. There's a possibility that they'll be able to get, the Tibetan government will be able to get weapons from the British government so they can defend themselves against the inevitable return of the Chinese in the future. So these things like the reconnaissance mission, they don't happen in a vacuum. There's a political aspect to it as well, and it's Howard Bury is very keen also, and you'll see it in the narrative he wrote a year later. He's very keen to put a positive spin on the British and to show the best sides, he put it as the British Empire. So and he had a personal liking for Tibetan people, that's clear. So the goal of the exhibition, its primary goal, is to find a route, to investigate Mount Everest and to find a route to the summit, or to see if there is a possible route to the summit. They're given instructions not to waste time trying to make a go for the summit, to find the route, but there's also this side mission in that it's to help establish better relations between the Tibetans and the British Empire, and to give the Tibetan people a good view of Britain and its empire. So we'll talk a bit about these men. This is Charles Howard Bury here, and we'll get into their various roles in the exhibition. This is Mallory, who Mark will talk about soon, and they had different goals. Like Bury was a brilliant manager and an explorer. He wasn't a mountaineer as such, so he wasn't going to be climbing peaks and so on. That was the likes of Mallory, for example, and another guy that we'll get to in a second, Bullock. So even at the time it obviously isn't the fancy mountaineering gear that they'd have, and Frank will give you a quick breakdown of that.
If you look at a photograph of the 1921 expedition, you see they're all dressed in tweeds and whatever. And indeed, I think it was George Bernard Shaw, when he saw the picture, he thought it was like a picnic in Connemara rather than on the side of Everest. So the gear, now the only thing about that is the gear, that sort of clothing actually works very well. This is the warmest clothing you could wear. Now what it didn't have was the breathable fabrics that we would have nowadays. But what they did have was the best of the time. And like they'd learned a lot from the guys who went to the poles. And the windproof anorak was really the thing they didn't have as well as they might. They still were very much into the tweeds.
Right, so picnic in Connemara was what they were dressed for, but obviously they were going to be doing more than that. Now I just mentioned Mallory and Bullock, for example. So that's Mallory there, and that's Bullock there, and they're the climbers. Their role is going to be out actually climbing cliff faces, climbing ice faces, trying to find if there is a path through certain areas, whereas Howard Bury will be overseeing the whole project, will be mapping as well. Now they are obviously climbing, but they're not going to be, we'll get more into it, where these guys are going to be actually with kit climbing up steep ice faces and so on. So you see this photo a lot, and you see that's the expedition. Of course, it's not. There was more than those 8 guys. Now, just go through. There's a couple of them, or there's a few of the extra people are worth talking about. There was one guy who's an important part of the exhibition, Alexander Kellis, and we'll get to him briefly in a moment. He was a very skilled mountaineer, very experienced mountaineer. He actually died on this expedition, and we'll get to that in a moment. But they also had a huge army, effectively, well, not an army, but 40 or 50 people, mostly Tibetan and Nepalese, Sherpas, baggage carriers, and guides, and so on. And here's a couple of these guys were instrumental to the expedition, a Tibetan and Nepalese guy, and they were of great assistance. They worked personally with Howard Bury, and they were kind of liaisons between the Tibetan state and the local people, because Howard Bury said that when the expedition arrived in locations around Tibet, a lot of people initially were worried because they had memories of the invasion back in 1903, 1904, and they thought there may be a similar thing about to occur, but they said, no, we're here for peaceful purposes. And Howard Bury said as well, when he started flashing cash and paying for mules and paying for food and hotels, people's opinions of him changed very quickly, and they became very welcome by the local community. These, as I said, it was being monitored back in, especially in Britain, but elsewhere around the world. The expedition, this is a relief map just to show you the elevations. They left from Darjeeling in India, which is about what's that, probably about 3,000 meters, Frank, is it? Yeah. So you can see that they had to head down, up, down, and a pass called the Jelipla Pass, very high area, and then they move into the, you can see here the Tibetan Plateau. There are peaks and so on, but it's generally of this high elevation, a little under 5,000, moving long trek into India. That is the spot where the guy I just mentioned, Alexander Kellis, he died during the expedition. He had been previously on an expedition just before this Everest one. He may have, some people have suggested it was heart failure, maybe exacerbated by the altitude they were at, but he was buried here in this fairly desolate location, and there's just that little stone there to mark the location. But this was taken a year later in a subsequent expedition, and it's a photo we got from the Alpine Club, but you can see the vast expanse of the Tibetan Plateau there, a fairly desolate and almost intimidating landscape. But as they got closer and closer to Everest, you'll get to see, and we'll talk some more about these and the people that they encountered as well. I just want to show you one map. Now, these are maps actually produced by the expedition itself, and these were released a year later. And they're some of the best maps we still have. You can see this is where, if you look here, they come in here and they walk. They have to travel all the way around, and this way, and they come back this way. But this is just to get into Everest here. So there's a huge trek across Tibet. If you're familiar with Tibet, Lhasa, the capital, is way off up in that direction. So they're only skirting the edges, the very southern borders of Tibet, to get to Mount Everest. And we'll hone in a moment on one of their more detailed map of Everest. But this is the explorations they take around the area. There's Everest itself. And we'll hone in on this area soon. But they're looking, obviously there's been nobody here before. There's no drones or aircraft. There's no mapping done. They have to take this terrain from the ground and produce these remarkable maps. So this is their primary goal during this expedition, is to produce this level of detail. And it's because of making that level of detail that will give future expeditions the opportunity, the knowledge and the wherewithal to actually make an attempt for the summit. And this is the actual map that we'll return to a lot of Everest. You can see there's the Everest summit, and these red lines are their explorations around here. They actually explore this area first, come back over and start exploring this area before they find an area called, that we'll discuss some more, the North Collar, the Changla, which becomes key to the whole expedition. But you can see the vast amount of effort. They left in Darjeeling in May, and it's not until late September that they find a potential route to the summit. So that's 4 months of very, very arduous effort, and they've already lost they've already lost Alexander Kellis, who's died obviously during the expedition. So even though you can see that they're going around, it's like a picnic in Connemara. It's serious, highly dangerous and very arduous work. Just to give you various photographs that Howard Bury took. They after the encounter, especially as they approached Everest, they encountered a large number of rivers that were flooded, and it took a lot of effort to cross those. More examples of they're the kind of tents. I think Mallory had done a lot of climbing in the Alps, yeah? So that's a lot of this expedition team specifically, a lot of their experience wasn't so much in the Himalayas, it was in the Alps. So they're entering new territory, and I just want to play Frank again, giving a sense of what they're now encountering when they're going up to, where the low level is 5,000 meters, and everything you do is effectively far beyond that.
People like Mallory, when they went to the Alps, the highest altitude they would climb in the Alps would be Mont Blanc. So they were used to being able to climb up to, say, 4,800. So 5,000 meters was, they knew that you could climb up to that. But when you went over 5,000, because the Everest base camp is at the height of, it's around 5,000 meters. So that's sort of, more or less the top of Mont Blanc. But when you try to climb higher, you're on 50% less oxygen than you would be at sea level. So obviously your mind doesn't, your brain doesn't work that well. Everything is slower. You get cold, and it wasn't known for sure if you could actually survive at that sort of altitude. So there was all sorts of experiments going on, and a lot of scientists reckoned that you needed supplementary oxygen in order to safely climb it, and that. And indeed, Callis on the first expedition, he was an expert in this, and he was experimenting in oxygen systems and kits for climbing in the Himalayas. So there was a good bit of knowledge about it, but nowadays it's very, very dangerous for someone to be any more than, say, 24 hours over 8,000 meters. And my own experience of being up on mountains, I noticed when I've been over 8,000 meters a couple of times, and I noticed that if you take off the oxygen mask, the colours diminish. You don't think as quick. You move slowly, basically because there's less oxygen to your brain, and everything just seems to happen slower. And the sharpness is things go out of focus a bit, and so you don't perform. So in order to climb Everest without oxygen, you really would want to have been living and operating at high level to get yourself acclimatized to be able to operate.
And that comes through a lot in the accounts, especially Mallory. He talks about how hard it is to maintain concentration, and it's just a sheer effort of trudging through snow, and how it's easy to make mistakes because you get into this rhythm. You have less oxygen, you can't think. It just becomes a remarkable chore. It becomes very hard to sleep. Charles Howard, that was Bury, seems to be his biggest complaint, was he found it very hard to sleep when he was up at high altitude. Especially, we showed a picture, and we'll come back to the Lac Pala. That's over 6,000 meters, and he found that, and he wasn't the guy to complain, but he found that particular area arduous. Now I just want to show, because the photos again are incredible, various people he encountered. That guy's that photo was the military governor, his wife and her mother. So she apparently, and she looks at, she wasn't too keen to be photographed, to drag her out. Usually, of course, the men were mad to get photographed, and there's loads of photos of men, various military types, posing and chests out and loving it. There is, the children don't look too happy to be photographed either. But there's many photos like this. This is a small military garrison that he encountered in one area, and Hot Springs, a place called Lambda, I think. They various, because he really enjoyed. I'm not sure if it's because of the colonial thing, but I'll talk briefly at the very end about his. He was against Indian independence, for example, but maybe because Tibetans were a free country. he could see them, treat them as equals, and he really did have a good rapport with the Tibetans, and the Tibetans seemed to really enjoy his company as well. That guy's an abbot in a monastery, and this is a monastery called Shekar, and I just want to play because Howard Bury took this photograph, which became famous all over Tibet, and was actually, until recently anyway, people might have the stereotypical, the Sacred Heart and a picture of JFK maybe and John Paul II. This was actually the Tibetan version of that, because as Howard Bury explains, this photograph was actually reproduced. Once people became aware of this photograph, it was reproduced all over Tibet and was put up on houses. And I just want to play a little bit of his account of this photo.
We were given very buttery tea in the roof courtyard, which was a pleasant spot, and here I photographed a group of several monks. They had never seen a camera or photograph before, but they had heard that such a thing was possible and were very much interested in it. Before leaving, we went in to see the head lama, who had lived over 66 years in this monastery. He was looked upon as being extremely holy and as the reincarnation of a former abbot, and they therefore practically worshipped him. There was only one tooth left in his mouth, but for all that, he had a very pleasant smile. All round his room were silver-gilt chortens, inlaid with turquoises and precious stones, and incense was being burnt everywhere. After much persuasion, the other monks induced him to come outside and have his photograph taken, telling him that he was an old man and his time on earth was now short, and they would like to have a picture of him to remember him by. He was accordingly brought out, dressed up in robes of beautiful golden brocades with priceless silk Chinese hangings arranged behind him, while he sat on a raised dais with his dorje and his bell in front of him, placed upon a finely carved Chinese table. The fame of this photograph spread throughout the country, and in places hundreds of miles away I was asked for photographs of the old abbot of Shekar Chote. Nor could I give a more welcome present at any house than a photograph of the old abbot. Being looked upon as a saint, he was worshipped, and they would put these little photographs in shrines and burn incense in front of them.
So you can see, like, they're taking their primary goal, as we'll get to now, is the mapping, but they're taking a real interest in Tibetan life as well. Now, this is the survey team, or one of the under Major Morse, and they had a number of Indian surveyors from the British Indian Civil Service, led by a guy called Gujar Singh, and another very important part of that team was Abdul Jalil Khan. He was a photographer. So these guys are often overlooked, but they were instrumental to those very detailed maps we saw a few moments ago. They were largely produced by these guys under the direction of Morsed and another member of the team, Wheeler. So I think there's Wheeler in action with some of his team. And I'm not going to go into the technicalities of the camera work, partly because I can't remember them. But they were around the whole area around Everest, taking the photographic data and making it into maps. Now, they suffered very badly. There's accounts that they just have to sit out for days at a time because of clouds, because of weather, and obviously that stymied their work. So I suppose in a way it gave them a break from the arduous nature of what they were doing, but it did slow down their efforts, and it did curtail what they were trying to do. Some more of an example of there, you can see the tents there. An example now, while the Wheeler and Morsed are out doing that, Mallory and Bullock, this is a photo from the Alpine Club, they're scaling ice faces like that. They're trying to find paths around the mountain. So that you can see the division of labour all overseen by Charles Howard Bury. That's what they're up to at the moment. There's Mallory, who Mark will talk about later. There's an example, that's Guy Bullock, I think, and you can see they wore these kind of nets, tennis racket type things when dealing in snow. Now, Bullock is showing these guys mountaineering techniques, because obviously they came from a mountainous background, but they weren't mountaineers as such. So those vital members of the team had to learn the mountaineering skills as well, and that's another aspect. And even when it was just a personal anecdote. When I was in Tibet, there was a guy in the hostel that was running the hostel, and he was from Lhasa, and that's about 3,000 meters or over 3,000 meters, and he said, he was asking me about the altitude and how he's finding it and so on, and he was saying that the first time he went to Everest Base Camp, which is about 5,500, that right, Frank? Yeah. He got very, very ill, even though he was a natural born Tibetan. So that's not something I had expected. So that was a factor as well. Okay, these guys that they're working with, that they've brought along, are mountain. They're from mountainous, high elevation areas, but they're not necessarily equipped to travel up over 6,000 meters or have the mountaineering skills to do so. This was either produced by Mallory or Bullock, and we'll come back to it in a minute. It's not particularly clear, but it will become more clear when we look at other. But here you have, becomes key to their whole expedition. Now I just want to hone in on a higher version of this map, and we're getting close to the summit of Everest now. This is that photo we showed there in the video, Frank, of you approaching the North Col, right? Was that from there? No?
No, just down where your finger is
there. There, from this side, right, just so I know. So they, it was taken from that area here, back actually further outside the photo, but they had spent lots of time around here. Is it fair to say, Frank, that if they had stumbled upon the East Rongbuk Glacier, they would have saved themselves a lot of bother if they had?
Yeah, they would. Well, Mallory and his crew had been up there.
They
actually missed. There was an opening into the East Rongbuk Glacier. Yeah, it was in a very narrow opening. They just missed it, but they passed it without seeing it.
Yeah, no, sorry about the folks. It's just, here's Mount Everest, right? So they start off here, and they're looking for to see if they can find a route to the mountain, and they struggle. They don't see.
So he actually tells Bury that there isn't a route.
Yeah. So they
come in from the other side.
They come back here. So but that adds an awful lot of effort, and there's a little.
After he left, Wheeler came up there, and he discovered the opening. But by that stage, the rest of the expedition moved on.
It moved on, yeah. They were all over here. So the little opening that Frank, because when they were in this area, if they had found this, no, and this isn't a criticism, it's just that if they had been lucky enough to find, they would have had the route all the way in like that. But is that where a lot of modern teams go up, Frank?
That's where everybody goes.
Yeah, so that's the way everybody goes. So they were unfortunate. They couldn't find this area. So they decamped from here, and they went all the way back over here, and they established another advanced base camp there. And they start to go up to this area called the where is it? The Lac Palais, and it's up here. And I'll see if I can get a photo for it. Sorry, wrong one. This is actually a photo taken from the Lac Palais. So, unfortunately, there's a better version in the Alpine Club which extends out here, but I wasn't able to get it in time. That's the summit of Mount Everest, and they see there's this area called the North Col. And we're going to go into more detail on that. They from the Lac Palais, they can see across, they see, oh, maybe this is what we've spent 4 months looking for. This could be our potential route. So just to go back, they're over here, and they're looking across. And that photo we just saw, there's Everest, and this is this route. And I'm just going to play another video with Frank, and it'll hone in on this video and explain a bit more. And we also have the, obviously, the names of which it's, that is the Tibetan name. That is a Nepalese name, Frank, yeah, Nepalese. And the Chinese have another name for it as well. I'm going to play that video about the importance of this area that they've seen called the North Col.
If you look from a distance, you could see the ridge that was coming down, the northeast ridge. It looked like a line that was very climbable from a distance. And the way to get onto it, there's one mountain called Changsi. They called it the North Peak of Everest. So between Changsi and that northeast ridge is a col, like a saddle on the mountain. And that is now known as the North Col, or in Tibetan it's the Chang La. Getting onto the Chang La was the key, but when they got up onto it, as soon as they actually reached the col, they were blown out of it with gales and winds, and the weather was totally unfavourable. So they weren't able to go any much higher than that. Now Mallory would have loved to have gone up further up the ridge, but the weather just didn't allow them. But they did actually reach the call, and they did very, very clearly that was a very viable route.
So we're just going to play Mallory's account, an actor reading Mallory's account. It's just a minute-long piece. So they've seen the North Column on the 24th of September 1921. They make an attempt of sorts, but the weather conditions are not good. But this is effectively the culmination of the expedition.
But what lay ahead of us? My eyes had often strayed as we came up to the rounded edge above the col and the final rocks below the northeast arête. If ever we had doubted whether the arête were accessible, it was impossible to doubt any longer. For a long way up those easy rock and snow slopes was neither danger nor difficulty. But at present there was wind. Even where we stood under the lee of a little ice cliff, it came in fierce gusts at frequent intervals, blowing up the powdery snow in a suffocating tourbillon. On the col beyond it was blowing a gale, and higher was a more fearful sight. The powdery fresh snow on the great face of Everest was being swept along in unbroken spindrift, and the very ridge where our route lay was marked out to receive its unmitigated fury. We could see the blown snow deflected upwards for a moment where the wind met the ridge, only to rush violently down in a frightful blizzard on the leeward side. To see, in fact, was enough. The wind had settled the question. It would have been folly to go on. Nevertheless, some little discussion took place as to what might be possible, and we struggled a few steps further to put the matter to the test. For a few moments we exposed ourselves on the col to feel the full strength of the blast, then struggled back to shelter.
Now, you get a sense, and you'll hear more from Mark about Mallory's character. He goes, it would be folly to go on, but yet they go on a little bit further. But that's Frank. And who was the guy with you, Frank?
Phil Thomas.
Now that's at the other side of the col, yeah? So, like you did, Mallory and Bullock are at the far side, and Bullock the next day, that's the high point of the expedition. They effectively say at this stage, they start to actually head back towards Darjeeling where they started. They say, we've mapped the area brilliantly, you've seen those, and we found the North Col, which we think is a very viable route to the summit. So that's effectively, but in his private diary, Guy Bullock said on the 25th, he said he was very relieved that they had decided to do that. Mallory, he said, was tempted to go on, but he would have followed Mallory, but his strength had given out, he said. So I think they're wrecked at this stage. They've done off, they've set out what they've achieved to do. And I'm not going to go into detail on subsequent expeditions, but the British come back with an expedition the next year to try and attempt to reach the summit, to follow on to build on the reconnaissance mission. And it's on the North Col that 7 people die, isn't it? Climbing up from the other side. On the other side, where Mallory and Bullock had been, 7 Sherpas are killed the following year in the next British expedition. So they took the right decision not to move on. So they start to head back towards, and that's from the Lac Palais looking across at Everest. So they produced these amazing maps. Everest, the North Peak marked with the Changla there. And the col is a Welsh word, is it? It's like a saddle.
It's a common term in the Alps.
Yeah, so it's a saddle basically. So that's why it's called a col, if you're wondering about that. That's a photo taken by Mallory as they're breaking up and starting to leave and head back towards Darjeeling. Now, as I was saying earlier, and we're not too far from the end, this was followed by the world's press. So when they come back, they're ready-made heroes. You can see encamped on the roof of the world. So it's almost surprising the extent to which newspapers and the media around the world were able to follow this. Not in real time, obviously, but within 2-3 weeks, they have images that we still use today. And there's the photo. Obviously, I meant to say it was colorized. It was colorized by the Royal Geographical Society, but that's the original, and the original is in Mullingar. As well, there's the photo of the climbing. So these photos, this is a French newspaper. So these photos are highlighting the successes. It's seen as a great British success, and Bury becomes, if only for a time, an international star. Now, there's one strange legacy of the, it's Jesus, like. when they were in the vicinity of the Lac Palat, they came across a footprint, what looked like a footprint. That already conditions you to think footprint, but they found a track of some sort. That was strange, and Howard Bury reckoned that it was probably a wolf or some kind of creature. Maybe the snow around it had melted and so on and made it look bigger and more human-like. It was human-like but bigger than a human. This is from 1950s now. This isn't the one that Howard Bury talked about. But Howard Bury was shocked when he got back to Europe. They come back, as I said, this has been in the world's press, and he had sent back reports mentioning seeing this strange track at up at about 6,000 meters. And just on that track, he was saying it was a wolf. The Tibetans with him were excited. They said, no, that's not a wolf. Don't be daft. That's the Mito Kangni, they called it, or that was Howard Bury's description. And they said it was a wild man who lives in these parts of the mountains. And when Howard Bury and the rest of the team got back to Europe, they were shocked to discover that many of the questions were about this wild man. The Times in London was running stories, and the Times was supposedly, the posh, sober paper, was running wild stories about wild, hairy murderers, literally, headlined, and Bury was amazed. But it shows how these kind of, we live in a world, obviously, of social media, conspiracy theories and so on, but this obviously is a human condition, and 100 years ago it was the same. It was the same thing. The story had outran Howard Bury already. Those original stories about wild, hairy men and hairy murderers. There was a guy called Newman who was a correspondent, a freelance journalist based in northern India, and his work was in the Times and in many other newspapers. And he came across that term, Mito Kangni, that was in one of Howard Bury's original reports, and he translated it as dirty snowman. And then he thought, that doesn't sound, what about abominable? And he said abominable snowman in one of his reports, and that phrase was picked up by newspapers around the world. So the abominable snowman was born. And this story goes on and on now, actually, but I won't go on and on. But the abominable story, this was picked up. So it took an existing Tibetan, Nepalese, Indian tradition, and it kind of gave it this I suppose, Western European sheen. So all of a sudden you had the tales of the Yeti. This is just a Mullingar or Westmeath Examiner report from early 1960s. But you can see it had already gone into the public consciousness by I suppose Tintin could be Charles Howard Bury. And, it had already gone into the public consciousness by the 1950s. So this was Eric Shipton, isn't that his name? He took in the 1950s expedition, he took that photo with the ice pick as a comparison, and that started a new craze for the Yeti and so on. And then, Tintin in Tibet, that was published in the 50s. But the story, where it becomes part of modern culture, is that in the 1960s, and I've tried to trace, and there's a gap somewhere along the line, but you can see in the 1920s, Howard Bury comes back with his story of encountering a single track that's unusual. That's where it lays for a few decades. And then in the 1960s, a guy called Sanderson, a British guy, writes a book in the United States about the wild creatures that live in the Himalayas and so on. And he takes the Howard Bury story, but he embellishes it. And in the new version, Howard Bury didn't encounter just a single track. He'd actually, through binoculars, seen 5 or 6 creatures high above them in the mountains. And like the story, because you've seen how arduous it is. They'd seen them about 1,000 meters, and apparently they went straight up and found, as if they could just go up 1,000 meters of the Himalayas. But they went up and they found a load of tracks. So that's the version that kind of passed into modern accounts. And it's a strange legacy of all the stuff they achieved. It's a strange aspect of their legacy, but it's an important part. And obviously, I'm just going to finish up on the fact that he leveraged, like he was a politician as well, or he leveraged his success in his political campaigns in the UK, and when he ran as Root said for the Senate, this was a flyer that was handed out printed by John P. Hayden, the printers of the Examiner. And obviously, first and foremost, he's the leader of the first Mount Everest expedition, awarded the gold medals of the French and British Geographical Societies. And I'm going to end with one short video just to encapsulate the achievement and to see his place within the wider context of explorers and mountaineers. And I'm going to turn again to Frank, our own mountaineer and explorer. So that was one of his election posters from Chelmsford in the general election. But his political career ended in the 1930s because, I mean, he was so wealthy at this stage that, why would you mess around with that? He just effectively retired, and he lived a life of travel and so on, and he was well celebrated in the locality here. And that's a picture of Rex, sorry. That's probably the 1980 or late 70s, is it? Yeah. So about 15 or 16 years after. There's Howard Bury himself in later life. That's probably in North Africa. And back to them. So we'll finish on this video, so just to explain his significance to the world at large.
He was awarded the Founders Medal by the Royal Geographical Society, and he was proposed for membership at the Alpine Club, and and by one of its vice presidents. And the funny thing about it is that if you look at the other Irish people that got the Founders Medal, you're talking about Robert McClure, made the Northwest Passage coming from the Bering Strait back into Greenland. He got it. Leopold McClintock got it for finding the remains of Franklin and explaining what happened to the Franklin expedition. And then we had Palliser, who was a Waterford man. He got it for surveying the Canadian Northwest Railway route. So, and of course, people like Robert Scott, Peary, Roel Amundsen, they all got the Founders Medal. So, he's ranked in there because they consider the Everest to be the equivalent of a third pole.
So that's it, folks.